put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The invisible theft. In March 2018, a whistleblower sat in a London hotel room, preparing to detonate a bomb that would shake the foundations of the most powerful social network ever created. His name was Christopher Wylie, a pink-haired data scientist who once believed he was building the future of political campaigning. Instead, he'd helped architect something far darker, a machine that could read minds, manipulate elections, and turn your most intimate digital footprints into weapons of mass persuasion. The target wasn't just democracy, it was you, and the scandal he was about to expose would reveal that Facebook, the company promising to connect the world, had instead sold access to the thoughts, fears, and desires of 87 million people without their knowledge. This is the story of how your data became the most valuable commodity on Earth, how a secretive British firm turned psychological profiles into political power, and how Mark Zuckerberg's empire discovered that in the business of surveillance capitalism, privacy wasn't a right. It was just another product to be monetized, exploited, and discarded. Welcome to the dark side of business, where the greatest theft in history wasn't money, it was your mind. The story begins not in Silicon Valley's gleaming offices, but in the shadows of military-grade psychological warfare. Cambridge Analytica, a British political consulting firm, was born from the darker corners of defense contracting and intelligence operations. Its parent company, SCL Group, had spent decades working on what they called strategic communication, a sterile term for something far more sinister: the science of changing how entire populations think, feel, and vote. By 2013, they'd identified their next frontier, not foreign battlefields, but the digital landscape of American democracy itself. And they'd found the perfect weapon: Facebook's ocean of personal data, a reservoir of human psychology so vast and so detailed that it made traditional voter files look like cave paintings. The architect of this operation was a man named Alexander Nix, Cambridge Analytica's CEO, whose aristocratic British accent masked an appetite for power that would make Machiavelli blush. Nix understood something fundamental about the new digital age. Whoever controlled the data controlled reality itself. Traditional advertising was a blunt instrument, broadcasting the same message to millions and hoping some would stick. But what if you could whisper different messages into millions of individual ears, each one calibrated precisely to that person's deepest fears, aspirations, and psychological vulnerabilities? What if you could make each person believe they'd arrived at their political opinions independently, when in fact, they'd been carefully guided there by invisible hands pulling invisible strings? This wasn't marketing. This was mind control at scale, and Facebook had left the door wide open. The gateway to this treasure trove was a seemingly innocent app called This Is Your Digital Life, created by a Cambridge University researcher named Alexander Kogan. In 2014, Kogan presented himself as an academic conducting personality research, offering Facebook users a few dollars to take a psychological quiz. About 270,000 people clicked accept, believing they were participating in harmless research. They had no idea they'd just unlocked Pandora's box, because Facebook's platform at the time had a feature that seemed almost designed for exploitation. When someone installed an app, it didn't just harvest their data. It harvested the data of everyone in their friend network. Every photo, every like, every comment, every page followed, every location checked in, every relationship status updated, all of it flowing through a digital pipeline straight into Cambridge Analytica's servers. Those 270,000 quiz takers had unknowingly given away the psychological profiles of 87 million people. It was the greatest data heist in history, and the victims never even knew they'd been robbed. Christopher Wylie, the young data scientist Cambridge Analytica had recruited, watched this extraction with growing unease. He'd been seduced by the intellectual challenge, the cutting-edge technology, the promise of revolutionizing political campaigning through big data and psychographics. But as the operation scaled, as the data poured in like crude oil from a gusher, he began to understand what they'd actually built. This wasn't just about winning elections. This was about weaponizing human psychology on an industrial scale. The firm's psychologists had developed models based on the OCEAN personality framework: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. By analyzing your Facebook activity, which pages you liked, which articles you shared, even how you wrote your status updates, they claimed they could predict your personality with disturbing accuracy. And once they knew your personality, they knew your pressure points. They knew what scared you, what angered you, what would make you click, share, and ultimately, vote. Alexander Nix pitched this capability to potential clients with the zeal of a snake oil salesman who actually possessed magic elixir. In presentations that would later surface, he boasted about Cambridge Analytica's work in elections across the globe. Nigeria, Kenya, India, over 200 campaigns worldwide. But his real target was America, where billions of dollars flowed through political campaigns and where the 2016 presidential election loomed on the horizon. The firm found its patron in Robert Mercer, a billionaire hedge fund manager whose fortune came from Renaissance technologies, one of the most successful and secretive quantitative trading firms in history. Mercer understood data better than most humans on Earth. He'd made billions by finding invisible patterns in financial markets, by letting algorithms detect signals human traders missed. Now, he wanted to apply that same computational power to politics. He poured $15 million into Cambridge Analytica, convinced that elections, like markets, could be hacked with the right data and the right algorithms. His daughter, Rebecca, joined the company's board, and together they began searching for a candidate who would let them prove their system worked. They found him in Donald Trump, or more accurately, in Steve Bannon, Trump's campaign strategist, who'd previously served as Cambridge Analytica's vice president. In June 2016, the Trump campaign hired Cambridge Analytica, and suddenly the firm's psychological warfare toolkit was aimed at American voters with laser precision. The campaign flooded Facebook with micro-targeted ads, not the broad messages you'd see on television, but thousands of variations, each one tailored to specific psychological profiles. If Cambridge Analytica's models identified you as high in neuroticism and low in openness, you might see ads emphasizing threats, crime, terrorism, economic collapse, designed to trigger your anxiety and channel it toward Trump as the strong protector. If you scored high in conscientiousness, you'd see messages about law and order, traditional values, the importance of rules and structure. The company even deployed what they called deterrence campaigns, targeted messages designed not to win votes, but to suppress them, to make certain demographics so disgusted, so confused, so overwhelmed that they'd simply stay home on election day. It was manipulation masquerading as marketing, propaganda disguised as personalization. But the Trump campaign was just the visible tip of a far darker iceberg. What Christopher Wylie discovered, what would eventually drive him to become a whistleblower, was that Cambridge Analytica wasn't just a political consultancy. It was a front for something far more sinister. In undercover recordings made by Britain's Channel 4 News, Alexander Nix was caught on camera, bragging about services that had nothing to do with legitimate campaigning. He offered to send beautiful women to seduce political opponents and film the encounters. He discussed using former spies to dig up dirt, to spread disinformation, to destroy reputations with false narratives planted in the media. We just put information into the bloodstream to the internet, and then watch it grow, Nix explained with chilling casualness. It has to happen without anyone thinking. That's propaganda. Because the moment you think that's propaganda, the next question is, who's put that out? This wasn't just about data analytics anymore. This was about corrupting democracy itself, about turning the tools of intelligence agencies and authoritarian regimes against free elections. And it had all been powered by data that Facebook's users had never consented to share. Data that Facebook's platform had made trivially easy to steal. Data that Facebook's executives had apparently never bothered to properly protect. Inside Facebook's Menlo Park headquarters, warning signs had been flashing for years. In 2015, a reporter from The Guardian contacted the company about Cambridge Analytica's data harvesting. Facebook's response was telling. They sent Cambridge Analytica a letter asking them to delete the data and certify its destruction. They received a written assurance that the data had been deleted. They did nothing to verify this claim. They didn't inform the 87 million users whose data had been compromised. They didn't shut down the vulnerability that had allowed the breach. They simply accepted Cambridge Analytica's word and moved on, hoping the problem would disappear into the digital void. It was a decision that reveals the fundamental truth about Facebook's business model. User privacy wasn't just secondary to growth and profit. It was actively hostile to it. Facebook's entire empire rested on collecting as much data as possible and making it as accessible as possible to advertisers and developers. Every restriction on data access was a restriction on revenue. Every privacy protection was a barrier to growth. Mark Zuckerberg had built the world's most sophisticated surveillance machine, and Cambridge Analytica had simply shown him what happens when you give that machine to people with no scruples and unlimited ambition. The scale of Facebook's negligence becomes even more staggering when you understand what was technically possible at the time. The company had the tools to monitor data flows, to detect unusual patterns, to identify when apps were harvesting data at suspicious volumes. They had armies of engineers who could have built better safeguards. They had lawyers who understood the implications of allowing third parties unrestricted access to user data. But they also had a growth strategy that depended on keeping developers happy, on maintaining the image of Facebook as an open platform where innovation flourished without burdensome restrictions. So they chose growth over protection, engagement over privacy, profits over principles. By 2018, Facebook was generating over $40 billion in annual revenue, almost entirely from advertising, powered by the detailed psychological profiles they'd built on over 2 billion users worldwide. Mark Zuckerberg's personal net worth had soared past $70 billion, making him one of the richest people on Earth before his 34th birthday. The company's stock price had multiplied nearly tenfold since its 2012 IPO, and all of it rested on a simple equation. The more Facebook knew about you, the more valuable you became to advertisers, the more money flowed into company coffers. Cambridge Analytica had simply taken this equation to its logical conclusion, proving that data wasn't just valuable for selling products. It could sell ideas, sell candidates, sell entire political movements. When Christopher Wylie finally went public in March 2018, appearing in coordinated exposés by The Guardian, The New York Times, and Channel 4 News, the reaction was volcanic. Within days, Facebook's stock price plummeted, wiping out over $100 billion in market value. Regulators across the globe launched investigations. Mark Zuckerberg was summoned to testify before Congress in a humiliating spectacle that revealed just how little lawmakers understood about the technology reshaping democracy. "Senator, we run ads," Zuckerberg explained patiently to one confused questioner, his tone barely concealing contempt. But beneath the public relations damage control, a more disturbing truth emerged. Facebook had known about the breach for years and had chosen to keep it quiet. They'd hoped it would remain a minor story, a technical violation that only policy wonks cared about. They'd calculated that transparency would cause more damage than silence. They'd gambled that users either wouldn't care or wouldn't be able to leave even if they did care, because Facebook had become too embedded in their digital lives to abandon, and they'd nearly won that gamble. But the Cambridge Analytica scandal was about to reveal something even more chilling. It wasn't an aberration. It was the business model. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Cambridge Analytica was just one of thousands of apps that had harvested Facebook data in similar ways. The company's internal documents, later leaked by whistleblowers and obtained through legal discovery, showed that Facebook's executives had explicitly discussed using privacy as a competitive weapon, cutting off data access to rival companies while maintaining it for preferred partners. In one email exchange, Mark Zuckerberg personally approved whitelisting certain companies for continued data access while restricting others, effectively picking winners and losers in the app ecosystem based on their value to Facebook. Another set of documents revealed that Facebook had considered charging developers for access to user data, treating people's personal information as a commodity to be priced and sold, like oil or wheat. The company had run experiments to determine how much apps would pay for different types of data access, effectively putting a dollar value on your friendships, your photos, your private messages. They'd ultimately decided against explicit charges, but only because it might attract regulatory scrutiny. The mentality remained. User data wasn't something to be protected. It was inventory to be monetized. And Cambridge Analytica had shown what happens when that inventory falls into the wrong hands. The scandal metastasized as more revelations emerged about Facebook's internal culture and decision-making. Former employees came forward describing a company obsessed with growth metrics to the exclusion of nearly everything else. Teams were rewarded for increasing engagement, time spent on platform, posts shared, ads clicked, with little consideration for whether that engagement was healthy or harmful. The company's algorithms, designed to maximize user attention, had learned that outrage and polarization kept people scrolling longer than nuance and empathy. So they fed users increasingly extreme content, creating filter bubbles and echo chambers that made Cambridge Analytica's manipulation easier and more effective. Facebook hadn't just failed to protect users from Cambridge Analytica, they'd built the perfect platform for psychological warfare, then acted surprised when someone used it for exactly that purpose. Mark Zuckerberg's famous motto, "Move fast and break things," had broken something fundamental: the expectation that companies wouldn't treat their users as raw material to be processed, packaged, and sold to the highest bidder. The legal and financial consequences began to mount like a slow-motion avalanche. In 2019, the Federal Trade Commission hit Facebook with a $5 billion fine, the largest penalty ever imposed on a company for violating consumers' privacy. To put that in perspective, it represented less than 9% of Facebook's revenue that year. The company made more money in the time it took to negotiate the settlement than the settlement cost them. Facebook's stock price, after its initial crash, had fully recovered and then some. Mark Zuckerberg remained firmly in control, protected by a dual-class share structure that gave him majority voting rights, regardless of how many shares he actually owned. The board, stacked with friendly faces and Zuckerberg allies, showed no interest in challenging his authority. In Britain, regulators fined Facebook a paltry £500,000, the maximum allowed under pre-GDPR laws, and roughly what the company made every 5 minutes. Cambridge Analytica itself declared bankruptcy and dissolved, but many of its key players simply rebranded and continued operating under different names, offering the same services with slightly more discretion. Alexander Nix was barred from serving as a company director for 7 years. a slap on the wrist for orchestrating one of the most audacious attacks on democracy in modern history. The message was clear. In the business of surveillance capitalism, crime pays extremely well, and punishment is merely a minor business expense. But perhaps the most disturbing lesson from the Cambridge Analytica scandal isn't what Facebook did. It's what they didn't do after being caught. Despite promises of reform, despite Zuckerberg's contrite testimony before Congress, despite full-page newspaper ads apologizing to users, Facebook's fundamental business model remained unchanged. They still collected vast amounts of personal data. They still used that data to build detailed psychological profiles. They still sold access to those profiles to advertisers. They still designed algorithms to maximize engagement regardless of social consequences. The only real change was better public relations, more sophisticated legal language, and more layers of plausible deniability. Facebook introduced new privacy controls, but buried them in settings menus that required dozens of clicks to navigate. They claimed to restrict data access for third-party apps, but continued to share extensive information with thousands of partners under various contractual arrangements. They promised transparency, then fought tooth and nail against every attempt by regulators, journalists, and researchers to actually examine how their systems worked. It was reformation as performance art, designed to placate critics without sacrificing profits. The scandal also exposed the toothlessness of regulatory frameworks designed for an earlier era. Lawmakers struggled to even ask coherent questions during Zuckerberg's congressional testimony, let alone craft meaningful legislation to prevent future abuses. The U.S., with its hands-off approach to tech regulation and its First Amendment protections that complicated restricting data-driven political campaigns, proved largely unable to constrain Facebook's power. Europe's GDPR provided stronger protections, but enforcement remained sporadic, and penalties, while larger than U.S. fines, still represented rounding errors in Facebook's financial statements. Meanwhile, the cat was out of the bag. Every political campaign, every marketing firm, every authoritarian government now understood that social media data wasn't just useful for advertising. It was a weapon for influencing elections, suppressing dissent, and controlling populations. Cambridge Analytica had provided the blueprint, and dozens of firms around the world were racing to replicate and improve upon their methods. The surveillance infrastructure was already built. The data was already collected. The techniques were already proven. All that remained was deciding who would wield this power and for what purposes. For Christopher Wylie, the whistleblower who'd started it all, vindication came mixed with profound disillusionment. He'd exposed the scandal hoping to spark meaningful reform, to force a reckoning with the dangers of surveillance capitalism. Instead, he watched as the same companies continued operating with minor modifications, as new scandals emerged and faded from public consciousness, as the attention economy moved on to the next outrage. In interviews, he described feeling like Cassandra, cursed to see the future clearly, but powerless to prevent it. "We opened Pandora's box," he said in one interview, his voice heavy with resignation. "We created this world where everyone's thoughts, everyone's behaviors, everyone's relationships can be monitored, analyzed, and manipulated at scale. And we did it so quickly, with so little oversight, that by the time people realized what had happened, it was too late to put things back." He'd hoped exposure would lead to accountability. Instead, it had simply taught bad actors to be more careful about getting caught. The psychological impact on users themselves remained harder to quantify, but potentially more insidious. Millions of people discovered that their data, information they'd shared with friends, photos they'd posted, thinking only their social circle would see them, preferences they'd clicked believing they were private, had been secretly harvested and weaponized without their knowledge or consent. The violation wasn't just technical or legal. It was intimate, a betrayal of trust that went to the heart of how people understood their relationship with technology. Facebook had positioned itself as a benign connector, a tool for bringing people together, maintaining friendships, sharing life's moments. The Cambridge Analytica scandal revealed it as something far different. A surveillance engine that monetized relationships, a manipulation machine that turned human connection into corporate profit and political power. Users faced an impossible choice: abandon platforms that had become essential infrastructure for modern social and professional life, or continue using them knowing they were products being sold rather than customers being served. Most chose to continue, a testament to how thoroughly these platforms had embedded themselves into the fabric of daily existence. The scandal had revealed the truth, but the truth, it turned out, wasn't enough to change behavior at scale. The business lessons from the Cambridge Analytica scandal cut deeper than simple ethics violations. They revealed fundamental tensions in how modern capitalism operates in the digital age. Facebook's core problem wasn't a few rogue employees or one bad partnership. It was a business model that required massive data collection and minimal privacy protection to function profitably. Every safeguard was a constraint on growth. Every privacy protection reduced the value of their advertising product. Every restriction on data access made their platform less attractive to developers and partners. The company faced a choice: prioritize user privacy and accept slower growth and lower profits, or prioritize growth and accept the risks of data abuse. They chose growth, as capitalist entities almost always do, when growth and ethics conflict. The real scandal wasn't that Cambridge Analytica harvested the data. It was that Facebook's entire business model was built on making such harvesting not just possible, but inevitable. They'd created the conditions for abuse, then acted shocked when abuse occurred. By 2025, Facebook, now rebranded as Meta in a transparent attempt to distance itself from accumulated scandals, had evolved but not reformed. The company's market capitalization had soared past $1 trillion, making it one of the most valuable entities on Earth. Mark Zuckerberg's personal wealth exceeded $100 billion, placing him among a tiny elite of centibillionaires whose fortunes rival the GDP of small nations. The business of surveillance capitalism had proven extraordinarily lucrative. Scandal or no scandal, regulation or no regulation, new features and platforms emerged. Virtual reality, the metaverse, AI-powered content creation. But the fundamental equation remained constant: collect data, build profiles, sell access, repeat. Cambridge Analytica had become a case study in business schools, a cautionary tale told to future executives about the importance of reputation management and regulatory compliance. But the deeper lesson, that some business models are fundamentally incompatible with democracy, privacy, and human dignity, remained largely unlearned. The infrastructure of manipulation had become too profitable to dismantle, too embedded to extract, too powerful to effectively regulate. The scandal's legacy extends far beyond Facebook itself, reshaping how we understand the relationship between technology, power, and democracy. Cambridge Analytica proved that data could be weaponized at unprecedented scale, that psychological manipulation could be automated and personalized, that the tools of connection could become tools of control. Authoritarian governments took note, deploying similar techniques for surveillance and social control. Democratic governments struggled to respond, caught between protecting civil liberties and preventing foreign interference. Corporations across industries recognized that behavioral data was the new oil, valuable beyond measure and worth almost any ethical compromise to acquire. The scandal had exposed the machinery, but the machinery continued operating, more sophisticated and more entrenched with each passing year. We now live in a world where every click, every like, every share, every pause is recorded, analyzed, and fed into algorithms designed to predict, and influence our behavior. Cambridge Analytica showed us that world. We chose to keep living in it anyway. In the end, the Cambridge Analytica scandal revealed an uncomfortable truth about modern business and democracy. When information becomes the primary commodity, when attention becomes the primary resource, when psychological manipulation becomes the primary business strategy, traditional safeguards prove inadequate. Mark Zuckerberg built an empire by convincing users to voluntarily surrender their privacy, to document their lives in granular digital detail, to trade personal information for the convenience of connection. Cambridge Analytica simply demonstrated what that surrender made possible. The billions made from the scandal, by Facebook through continued data harvesting, by Cambridge Analytica through political consulting contracts, by the broader surveillance capitalism industry that emerged from their blueprint, represent one of history's most profitable betrayals of trust. And the most chilling aspect isn't what happened. It's that despite everything we learned, despite the exposure and the outrage and the investigations, the same systems remain in place, collecting more data, building more detailed profiles, developing more sophisticated manipulation techniques. The scandal changed everything and nothing. We know we're being watched, analyzed, and manipulated. We just haven't figured out how to stop it. Or perhaps more disturbingly, we've decided the convenience is worth the cost. So here's what Cambridge Analytica really taught us. In the age of surveillance capitalism, your mind isn't your own. It's a battlefield where corporations and political operatives wage invisible wars for influence and control. Every photo you share, every article you read, every friend you make online becomes ammunition in this war. Data points feeding algorithms designed to predict your thoughts before you think them, to shape your opinions before you form them, to sell you products and ideas and candidates you never knew you wanted. Facebook didn't create this world alone, but they built the most powerful infrastructure for it, then partnered with those who would exploit it most ruthlessly. The billions they made, the democracy they compromised, the privacy they destroyed. These weren't bugs in the system. They were features, working exactly as designed. And that whistleblower in the London hotel room, preparing to expose it all. He changed history, sparked investigations, toppled companies, and forced a global reckoning with data privacy. But the machine he helped expose kept running, faster and more sophisticated than ever. Because the truth, it turns out, was never enough to stop it. Welcome to the dark side of business, where the greatest theft in history happened in plain sight, where 87 million people were robbed without knowing it, and where the thieves not only got away with it, they got richer than anyone imagined possible. Your data made billions. You just never saw a penny of it. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.